Jared Polis. We'll be beginning our panel in about 3 or 4 minutes. This is Jared Polis. I just wanted to welcome you all to our discussion about North Korea. I know a lot of people are worried about North Korea. We have 4 amazing experts here. Once again, this is Jared Polis. We'll be beginning our panel discussion in about 3 or 4 minutes. We wanted to give people a chance to join the room for our discussion regarding North Korea with 4 experts. I'm Jared Polis. I wanted to welcome you to our virtual town hall and digital roundtable about North Korea and the threat with regard to nuclear proliferation and nuclear proliferation. We are joined by 4 panelists. We'll be beginning in about 2 or 3 minutes. I'll be giving a brief introduction. Each of our panelists will present for a couple of minutes, and then we'll get to questions. This is Jared Polis. We'll be beginning in about 2 or 3 minutes. And I want to thank you for tuning in. Once again, this is Jared Polis. I want to welcome everybody. We'll be beginning in about 2 minutes with our panel discussion about North Korea. Hi, this is Jared Polis. We'll be beginning in about 1 or 2 minutes with our exciting and panelists about a very important topic to all of us, and that is North Korea. I know it's a little bit scary what we hear in the news, and I wanted you, my constituents, to have the benefit of learning about it as I do from some top experts nationally and in Colorado about North Korea. Hi, this is Jared Polis, and I just wanted to welcome you to our digital roundtable, where we will be learning about North Korea and the situation regarding nuclear proliferation and nuclear threat. Thanks for joining us. We'll be beginning in about 1 minute. This is Jared Polis, and I wanted to welcome you to our digital roundtable. We'll be beginning in about 1 minute. This is Jared Polis. We'll be beginning in just a moment. We will be beginning in 1 minute. This is Jared Polis. I wanted to welcome you to our digital roundtable regarding North Korea with 4 experts who know a lot about the Korean Peninsula and the politics and national security considerations of the area. We'll be beginning in less than 1 minute. Okay, time to begin. Welcome, everybody. I see a few comments already. Lisa says it's very scary, and John appreciates the information we're about to give, and John wonders how it's going. It's going well. Thank you, John. So let's start. You know, a big welcome to everybody joining our Facebook Live digital roundtable. I know there'll be others joining us throughout the night, and feel free to post your comments, and we'll get to those after our experts talk to us for a couple of minutes about the situation. Since coming to power in 2011, Kim Jong-un has taken a number of steps that have been very worrisome to develop North Korea's nuclear capabilities and even further isolating the nation from the outside world. In many ways, North Korea is the most dangerous and unpredictable threat to the United States at the international level. I remember a discussion with President Obama before he left office, I think it was with our Democratic caucus in the House, about what he was most worried about on the international front, and he said it was North Korea. Over the last 11 years, North Korea has conducted 6 underground nuclear tests. Each one of those is more powerful than the last. The most recent one was September 23rd, and it was the type of nuclear weapon that could be attached to long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, which I think we believe that they have some capabilities of launching those as well. They recently launched an unarmed warhead over our allies in Japan. There's also been threats directly against U.S. territories like Guam, and they might even have the capability of reaching the U.S. mainland or certainly Hawaii. More than ever, we need a diplomatic solution to this crisis, which seems to be getting worse and worse. There's many different routes the U.S. could take. We'll discuss some of them on our panel today, as well as the implications of the actions that President Trump has taken so far. But however we do it, preventing North Korea from developing their nuclear program is a top priority for our country and needs to be for our administration and our Congress on a unified front. We certainly need to engage our regional allies, South Korea and Japan, in this conversation, and of course, China as well, which is absolutely critical, plays a role, leading role in the de-escalation of the threat, and hopefully will find it in their own interests to do so. For the safety and security of ourselves, our allies, to prevent a catastrophe of immense dimensions if there were the actual use of nuclear weapons. It's critical that we engage the international community to de-escalate. I recently signed on to a letter with 68 other members of the House calling for President Trump to adopt a strong, strategic, and steady policy towards North Korea. Obviously, many are concerned about the seemingly disregard of a process around the inflammation and rhetoric that he has used with regard to the personal issues with Kim Jong-un. Tonight, I'm excited to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts. First, they should all be on the bottom of your screen from left to right. We will go to them in the order that I'm introducing them. This is actually would be from right to left on your monitor, I believe. First, we have, and if you don't mind just waving when I introduce you so we know who you are, we have Abe Denmark. Abe is the Director of Asian Programs at the Wilson Center. I'm also proud that he's a Fort Collins native. He served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia, where he supported the Secretary of Defense and other senior U.S. officials in the formulation of our national security policy. He's an author of a number of books and articles about the situation. He's testified before United States Congress on the U.S.-China Commission and a number of other appearances on press, including NPR, Financial Times. He truly knows a lot about the situation from somebody who was recently in an executive role. He has a number of honors as well. He received the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service, is an honorary admiral in the Navy of the Republic of Korea, and was named a 21st Century Leader by the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And as I said, we're very excited he's a Colorado native as well. Jenny Town, our next panelist, is the Assistant Director of the U.S.-Korea Institute at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She manages programs on North Korea, nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, and energy security. She's the managing editor and producer of 38 North, which is a great web-based journal that provides analysis of events around North Korea. She's an expert reviewer, and she also is the communications director for the PSEX Prize, the director of the Washington office for the government relations at the College Board, and she sits on the board of the Melton Foundation. So Jenny, we're so excited to have you here, and thank you for all your work in this area. The next speaker we'll have is Mike Fuchs. Mike is a senior fellow at American Progress, which focuses on U.S. foreign policy priorities in the Asia-Pacific region. He was also very recently the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2013 through 2016. So his experience is also very very new from the administration. Before he was at the Department of the State, he was the Deputy National Security Director for Hillary Clinton in 2008. He's also a lecturer at George Washington University. We have another Coloradan on the panel as well, Professor Steve Chown. Steve holds the title of Professor of Distinction at University of Colorado. He received a number of awards there, and including a fellowship from the East Asian Institute in Seoul. His research interests include international relations, political economy, foreign policy. He's published numerous articles in journals, both domestic and internationally, and brings a wealth of expertise, and we're excited to have a distinguished member of the faculty from the University of Colorado. Abe, we'd like to begin with you. If you can we're going to about 2 to 3 minutes each, and tell us a little bit about what me and my constituents should know about the situation on the Korean Peninsula. After the initial presentations of all 4 panelists, we'll get to some questions. Again, this is Jared Polis. I want to welcome everybody to our digital roundtable about the very serious and very important topic of the instability in the Korean Peninsula and the potential nuclear implications. Abe?
Thank you, Congressman. It's good to talk to you. I'll do my best as a DC person now to speak for only 2 or 3 minutes. The first thing I think that you and your constituents should know about North Korea, especially, is that it's a failed state. It's a failed state run and led by a dynastic cult, primarily and solely focused on preserving its own power and preserving its own rule. The North Korean economy is very small. Estimates range between $28 billion and $40 billion. To give you an idea of that, the upper range of that estimate, $40 billion, is roughly the same economic output of Boulder County plus Fort Collins. So it's a very small economy. Their people have very small access to resources. The famous picture from space of an entire region lit up like a Christmas tree with North Korea being quiet except for one small doubt over Pyongyang is very telling about what they are. But as I said, they're very focused on preserving their own rule, preserving their own regime, and they see the development of a nuclear deterrent as essential to defending themselves and deterring an attack from the United States. North Koreans point to Saddam Hussein, point to Gaddafi in Libya as people who made deals to abandon nuclear programs and then were betrayed by the international community and deposed from power. So they remain very committed to developing a nuclear capability, including a missile capable eventually of striking not only our allies and our partners, but also potentially striking the United States with a nuclear weapon. Now, President Trump has been very clear that he cannot accept North Korea armed with the ability to strike the United States with nuclear weapons, and clear that he will only accept denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula as the solution to this problem. He has really closed off many other diplomatic options short of absolute and total denuclearization, which North Korea has been very clear that they're not interested in. So as they continue to conduct nuclear tests and missile tests, some flying over Japan, as you mentioned, they're getting increasingly closer to achieving their goal of a credible nuclear deterrent, presenting the United States with a very terrible choice between, one, attempting to contain and deter North Korea that has a record of challenging our ability to contain and deter them, or attempting to conduct some degree of military strike that has the potential to escalate into a disastrous conflict that could threaten the lives of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people in Korea, Japan, and potentially in the United States. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I want to turn it over to Jenny at the U.S. Korea Institute. Thank you, Abe, and we'll get to our comments in a moment. I now go to Jenny Chown.
Great, thank you for having me. I think I'm going to start my remarks by actually disagreeing a little bit about what Abe said, and especially on the first point, the idea that North Korea is a failed state, because it's not a failed state. It does have a government system that works, It works on its own terms, and just because we don't like the system doesn't mean it doesn't exist and that it's not functioning, and that actually it functions well and controls the people. And while they do have a small economy, it is still, and it still does have a national economy, and it still does function as a normal, not as a normal state, but as a functioning state. I think, you know, North Korea certainly has been working on its nuclear weapons development over several years, or several decades, actually. And realistically, what we're seeing now is not new or surprising. I think the biggest difference now is that North Korea has in recent years felt under greater threat. It had a very bad relationship with the Obama administration. And there was a lot of talk about, you know, unification, South Korean-led unification during the Park Geun-hye administration in South Korea as well. There were expansion of the U.S. ROK joint military drills that really included strategic overflights. It included, you know, strategic assets in the region, and also the decapitation drills as well. So, you know, the North Korean regime has seen sort of a growing threat and a growing discontent from the international community. And instead of falling in line and trying to be a better global citizen and follow the international norms, has instead tried to exercise its brinkmanship to show that it won't be intimidated by big states. I think that the biggest difference of what we see here now today, and why what's led to this, what we consider a crisis now, is that, you know, North Korea has now demonstrated it does have some ICBM capability that's further along than what we ever imagined. And so, you know, it really has first caught the imagination of the American people. So now suddenly it is a threat that the Americans feel is real. Even though the South Koreans and the Japanese have lived under this threat for decades as well, because North Korea has had short-range and medium-range missiles that could cover the region. On top of that, I think, you know, I agree with what Abe was saying in terms of where the administration is thinking now, and I would add to that that not only has Trump posed this as sort of a zero-sum game, as you must give up nuclear weapons or will be destroyed, but really has staked his reputation on being able to solve this issue, and an issue that past administrations have not been able to solve. And because of that, it does, like he says, it does remove a lot of options off of the table in terms of, you know, being able to navigate a more moderate path in order to rebuild relations enough to really get into a constructive place. So it also makes the idea of containment and deterrence policy, rather than, you know, something more drastic in the near term, a harder sell, because it's not really solving the problem. And Trump, being the great negotiator, has really staked, again, his reputation on being able to solve this. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jenny. We'll go to Mike Fuchs. Mike?
Great. Thank you, Congressman. It's a pleasure to be here participating in this conversation. And I first want to very much agree with a lot of the things that Abe and Jenny said to kick off this conversation, and you as well. The few things that I would just share right off the start with you and your constituents about North Korea is that we have been at this, the United States and our allies in the international community, for a very long time. Obviously, we fought a war against North Korea in the early 50s. Since 1953, we have been trying one form or another to basically prevent a recurrence of another Korean War, which was absolutely devastating for not just the region, but also for the United States and our troops. And so one of the things that we have been doing as a priority is trying to prevent another catastrophe on the Korean Peninsula. Obviously, we have also been trying to open up diplomatic channels, improve the situation, and curb North Korea's illicit nuclear and missile programs. And I think one of the things that's important to remember is that, one, diplomacy is the only way that this is going to get solved at the end of the day. We can have as much pressure as we want on North Korea, but at some point, we will come to the table, they will come to the table, and we will talk about how to actually resolve this problem. And even though it was a failed attempt in the 1990s, the Agreed Framework Agreement between our countries. A diplomatic deal was struck in the mid-90s that actually halted part of North Korea's nuclear program for a span of at least a number of years, and allowed us to have wider diplomatic conversations about a range of different issues. And so for all those, I think, who think that diplomacy is weak or think that diplomacy somehow can't yield results, I think that it's important to remember that, one, it's the only way that we will actually get any results here that we want. And two, it has in the past shown promise and the possibility of working. And so again, I think that as we move forward here, and there are lots of things that we should be doing to reassure our allies, to make sure we can deter North Korean aggression, which is very real and very dangerous, the first priority needs to be making sure that we are preventing the outbreak of another war. The final thing I would say is, to play off of what Jenny and Abe said, is that the thing that makes me most nervous right now is that what President Trump is doing in terms of the hyperbolic rhetoric that he throws at Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime, and the other actions that the administration has taken to date, raise the chances of a miscalculation between the two sides. And it's not necessarily just the chance that we launch an all-out war, but more that a miscalculation, like frankly has happened in the past when North Korea has, for instance, shot down US aircraft in the past, sunk a South Korean vessel like they did in 2010. These are the kinds of incidents that start off relatively small, but can quickly escalate into a much bigger war. And so that is what concerns me most right now.
Thank you, Mike. Professor Chan, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for organizing this panel, and for your staff for helping to organize this panel. I'm delighted to be here. I think it would be useful for us to start by asking this question. What does North Korea want, and what does it believe the United States wants? And also, what do we, the United States, want, and how do we go about convincing North Korea that we want what we say we want? Now, we may disagree with North Korea's perspective, but it's important, perhaps, and pertinent for us to set the table by recalling three recent events. In 2003, the United States attacked Iraq, claiming that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction or was about to have them. It turns out that this claim was groundless. People in Moscow, Beijing, and North Korea believe that we attacked precisely because Saddam Hussein did not have these weapons, that it was dangerous not to have these weapons to deter the United States. Whether we thought we attacked Iraq because we thought Saddam Hussein had these weapons, or we attacked because we thought he did not have them, neither interpretation is reassuring to Pyongyang. Episode number 2. Colonel Gaddafi, in order to avoid the fate of Saddam Hussein, offered to surrender his facilities to build these weapons of mass destruction. He asked the international community to inspect his dismantlement. And of course, in 2011, NATO forces attacked him, and he died at the hands of the rebels. And Chinese and Russian diplomats openly confessed that they thought they were fooled by a bait-and-switch strategy, that their support for the no-flight zone turned out to be an agenda to engage in regime change in Libya. And most recently, the third episode has to do with what President Trump has done. He decertified the Iran deal. This was a multilateral deal involving not just Iran and the United States, but China, Russia, France, and Britain. And the reason why this is a multilateral deal is to lock in and reassure both Iran and the United States. And we, the United States, supported this deal in the United Nations, along with 14 other members of the Security Council. And the fact that we are now walking away, even though our allies, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and our intelligence community all agree that Iran is abiding by the terms of this deal, naturally will cause North Korea to ask this question: will any deal reached with the United States be enforceable? What if they were to disarm and the United States decides to attack subsequently? What recourse would they have? And what could the international community do about it? I think we need to overcome these perceptual obstacles in reaching a deal. Let me also quickly say that the United States has to decide what kind of opponent we are dealing with. Are we dealing with a North Korea that is essentially playing offense, or are we dealing with North Korea essentially playing defense? If the North Koreans are the offensive type, aggressive, expensive, then the proper strategy is to deter and contain them. If they are the insecure defensive type, looking for diplomatic recognition and regime survival, then the proper course of action is to negotiate and reassure them. I do not see, quite frankly, the danger coming from them as a direct attack on the United States or our allies, because to do so, they will have to basically sign their own death warrant. They will invite a massive retaliation and their own demise. And they are not suicidal. So let me start by saying that the United States has lived with nuclear weapons in the hands of the Pakistanis, the Indians, the Chinese, and the Russians. Now, North Korea may be very different. One can make a case, but I yet have to hear a compelling case arguing that North Korea is different. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Chan. And there's actually a very good question that'll be our second one about, because I think an assumption there is that the regime in North Korea is rational, and we'll want to explore whether in fact they're rational or irrational. I want to start with Zach's question though. Zach asked a few questions. He said China's relation with North Korea should be easier to gauge after the Communist Conference of China it concludes. How does the United States coordinate more effectively with China to prevent North Korean possession of nuclear-armed ICBMs? And I would pose this to whoever wants to answer, but what would be the most effective way to demonstrate to China, show China how urgent this is for us, and really get them to play a more meaningful role in this conflict? Mike?
Sure. I think that you need a dual strategy with China, which is to say you need, on the one hand, to show China that there will be consequences for Beijing if China does not actually live up to the implementation of UN Security Council sanctions that have been imposed on North Korea for years now, which China, frankly, tries to have its cake and eat it too. It tries to look like it's implementing the sanctions, look like it is taking harsher measures against North Korea to cut off things like materials that they need for their illicit programs and other things that fuel their economy. But at the same time, not go all the way. And so I think that on the one hand, you need to be able to show Beijing that you're going to apply pressure, which comes back to a question of secondary sanctions that you might impose on Chinese banks and financial institutions if they're not going to comply. But at the same time, you need to also show China that you have a real willingness to engage in diplomacy and that there is a off-ramp to this. There is a path forward here. And that means, going back to what we talked about earlier, which is showing North Korea and the Chinese that there is a real diplomatic solution and a diplomatic opportunity to reduce tensions. And if China sees that that is a real possibility, they are going to be more likely, I think, to encourage the North Koreans to go that route, and frankly, more likely to, I think, also live up to Security Council resolutions.
Would anybody else like to comment on bringing the Chinese to the table?
Can I say a few words?
Yes.
I would agree with Mike in saying that the dual strategy, yes, they need to implement sanctions. And the criticism from China has always been, you know, we do our part. We're doing more than we did before, even if it's, you know, never perfect. But they do also criticize and point out that the UN Security Council resolutions also have a mandate for diplomacy as well, for negotiations. And so without that other part, you know, what exactly is the goal of sanctions? And so I think, you know, there's been a lot of criticism from the Chinese when the US always says you should be doing more and you should be doing, you know, taking care of this problem. And the response is oftentimes, well, the more should also be coming from the United States, and that has to be on the diplomatic track. Because at the end of the day, I think people really overestimate the political influence that China actually has over North Korea. You know, North Korea likes Chinese business, and yes, China has economic levers it can push, but that doesn't necessarily translate into political influence over the regime. And especially since Kim Jong-un has come to power, he's been very adverse to listening to China and to, you know, following Chinese desires. And so I think, you know, the more we can have indications that direct diplomacy and direct negotiations are possible, along with other tracks. The more the Chinese are willing to do in that process, and the more reassured I think everyone will be in that process.
If I could chime in.
Go ahead, Abe.
Yeah, I think both Mike and Jenny had it exactly right. But there's a deeper challenge here, that because North Korea, at least so far, has been unwilling to come to the table and actually negotiate on denuclearization, that the strategy for this administration and for previous administrations has been to increase pressure, to cut off economic and diplomatic ties, so to induce Pyongyang to come to the negotiating table, to put in place enough economic pain that they have no choice other than to get to the negotiating table. The challenge is that, one, it's unclear if that level exists, because they see nuclear weapons as so essential to the preservation of the regime that it's unclear if they see an opportunity, if North Korea is even willing to have that negotiation. But even more importantly for this conversation, for this question, is that China has been especially concerned that sanctions that are too harsh, that cut too deep, would undermine the stability of the regime in North Korea, which they are especially concerned about. So the question is there enough pressure that China would be willing to put in place that would also be strong enough to force North Korea to the table, but not so strong that it would cause the regime to collapse in China's eyes? I think that's the challenge that we've been having so far.
Thank you. And let me go to Professor Chan. We have a question from Alan that says, diplomacy is a worthy objective, but how do you negotiate with an irrational megalomaniac like Kim? And I think the premise there, Professor Chan, is, you kind of gave the rational explanation as to why North Korea might seek this status, given what happened in other countries. Is that a legitimate premise with regard to the rationality that drives the decision-making process of Kim Jong-un, or are there other considerations? And I'll give you and others a chance to answer that.
Thank you. I actually believe that the North Korean regime is very rational, astute. It has been playing China, the United States, and Russia off each other. And it's betting, to follow up on the previous question, it's betting that at the end, China will choose North Korea rather than the United States. That when push comes to shove, even though China does not like to have a nuclear-armed North Korea, it would rather not have a united Korea, which hosts United States troops on Chinese borders. And the Chinese calculation, if I may just follow up by saying, is that let's imagine the North Korean issue has been settled. Would China and US relations be better? Or would China actually now have less of a leverage over the United States with the North Korean issue laid to rest? And that China will come even more increasingly into the focus of the United States strategic headlight. And North Korea, I think, understands this. It is betting on China will not, in the end, push sanctions so hard that North Korea will collapse. In fact, if I may just add one more thing, many of us sometimes voice the feeling that we could turn up the heat and cause North Korea to say uncle, that there is a breaking point for North Korea. I think actually there is a perverse, unintended consequence here. The danger lies in the fact that if North Korea were to really come under duress, economic duress, we have to ask ourselves, what is the one remaining export it can make? Something that can really hurt the United States. And I'm here, of course, alluding to the fact that they could engage in surreptitious transfer of nuclear and missile technology to countries like Iran and terrorist groups like ISIS. That would be, I think, our worst nightmare. So I don't think Kim is irrational.
Does anybody else have an opinion on whether we can count on kind of a rational response from North Korea, or there's other considerations?
Yeah, can I?
Go ahead.
So I think, having done a lot of Track 2 work, I've actually been parts of conversations outside of government with North Korean government officials. And what Abe had talked about and what the professor had talked about, there's this there's this divergence of views of how you approach this issue. And I think the government has always been very insistent on framing the dialogue as this has to be a negotiation about denuclearization. And the way that the North Koreans look at this is that that is agreeing to and conceding to an endpoint before you get to the table. And when you talk about how do you get a big ego like Kim Jong-un to come to the table, a part of it is you have to give him the right optics to be able to have the discussion. And so in Track 2 meetings with North Korean officials, one of the things that we talk about is that no, they are not going to concede to things before they get to a negotiation process. They want to be able, especially as a small country that feels under threat, they want to be able to come to the table and to be able to talk about, for instance, mutual security concerns. And if you can create the optics so it doesn't look that they're conceding before they start the negotiation, it gives them the opportunity to come in and you can air your grievances, and they know very well that the US is going to start with and cares most about their nuclear program. But then they can also air their security grievances as well in that process, and then you can negotiate what that endpoint of the negotiation is and figure out what's actually possible. I think, you know, in the past, and as someone who's been outside of government watching all of this happen and been sort of involved in Track 2 and trying to help facilitate the how do we get government back on track, government talks back on track, this has been the most frustrating thing for us, is that there have been signals that the North Koreans are willing to negotiate, but they're not willing to look like they're getting bullied into it in the process.
So let me go to a couple of questions about our own president and our own policies. Valerie asked, how do we stop, or what can Congress do to stop President Trump's threats of war or escalation? Is there no interest in diplomacy? Bob asked, why should North Korea trust President Trump after he's pulled out of several international agreements? Another issue that Bob raised is Trump's inability to de-escalate the issue. Bob also brought up that, if he recalls, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK agreed not to invade Cuba as part of the deal to have USSR remove its missiles. So moving from the discussion of kind of the motivations and rationality of the North Korean leader, how can whatever action we take to de-escalate, how can we engender trust given our own president's rhetoric, heated rhetoric, and history with regard to pulling out of international agreements? Mike, go ahead.
Sure. Take a first crack at that. Well, I think that the number one recommendation I would have is for the folks at Twitter to delete President Trump's account. I think that would be the most constructive thing for diplomacy and chances of peace on the Korean Peninsula that anyone could take right now. Assuming that's not going to happen, I think that in particular, Congress has an incredibly important role to play right now. You, Representative, I commend you for doing this event and speaking out on this, but Congress right now is the only other branch of the federal government that has a role, a real role to play here. And for the most part, when it comes to wars overseas in recent years, Congress has either consented to it, as in 2002, or not, frankly, put up enough of a fight against aggressive military action that was destabilizing, so that the president is allowed to take the steps that he thinks he should. And so in this case, where I think, again, the things we're seeing out of the White House are so beyond the pale in terms of the potential for destabilizing the situation, that it is a situation in which Congress needs to be speaking out with as one voice whenever possible. Whether that's through legislation, whether that's through constantly being out there talking about it with constituents and so forth. I think this is one of those issues where Congress needs to ratchet up the pressure on the president.
Any other comments?
Yeah, if I may chime in, I think the question about rhetoric is really very pertinent. I recall that one of the greatest tragedies involving the Vietnam War was that we escalated rhetoric and got ourselves trapped in our own rhetoric. we had publicly and persistently stated that South Vietnam was vital to the national security of the United States, and we would stand by our allies there. And our rhetoric, therefore, prevents us from considering other policy alternatives, including the option of leaving. In the end, the United States paid a heavier reputational cost, and our prestige suffered more than otherwise would be the case. And it seems to me plain that military solution is not on the table, is not viable in addressing the North Korean issue. So the earlier we start talking, the better it is, and we should not engage in rhetoric that will back us into a corner. I'll stop here.
Abe.
Yeah, just very quickly, just to emphasize Mike's point, I thought it was a terrific point, that elections have consequences, that President Trump is the commander-in-chief of our armed forces, and therefore has a tremendous amount of power and authority to make those sorts of decisions. The Congress, the legislature, also, though, has a very important role. Mike mentioned 2002, the debate of the authorization on the use of military force in Iraq was an especially important and consequential debate. And that is where our Congress has the ability to represent the American people and weigh in on these decisions. And so far, we haven't had that debate yet. This is a crisis that threatens the lives of millions of people and puts American people in danger. Yet we haven't had that debate yet. So I think that that debate, that conversation, and the role for the Congress is especially important right now to discuss these issues, evaluate them, and make sure that the voices of the American people are heard.
Yeah, and I would add that when Congress comes together as an institution with more than 2/3 vote, it effectively can override a president. We actually did, in the realm of foreign affairs, remove the authority of President Trump to unilaterally remove the sanctions against Russia, nearly unanimously in the House. I think only a few members of the House voted against that. President Trump was effectively backed into signing a bill that reduced his own authority, almost unprecedented, certainly in the time that I've been here. Michael asked a question, are there any circumstances under which the United States would simply live with or accept the fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons like Pakistan or India and really do nothing else about it? Let me go to Abe on that.
Sure. There are currently two non-ally countries capable of striking the United States with nuclear weapons, Russia and China. And with Russia especially, we've had a long history of very sophisticated discussions to maintain stability. With China, less so. But North Korea, many fear, is a very different type of threat because of their history of provocations against their allies, against their neighbors, going back decades, because of certain things that they've talked about reunification of the Korean Peninsula, raises concerns about the ability to deter. There's really two different aspects to this. One is deterrence at the strategic level. The traditional mutual assured destruction or minimal deterrence which is more applicable. And the professor is exactly right there, that they're not suicidal. Preventing them from attacking the United States or allies with nuclear weapons is certainly a very achievable deterrence goal. The challenge really is at a lower level. You may recall that in 2010, North Korea attacked South Korea. They sank a South Korean ship. They shelled a South Korean island. And that's a reflection of past smaller scale incidents going back decades. And the question is, if North Korea, feeling emboldened by a nuclear umbrella, would feel that they are more open to putting pressure on South Korea, on Japan, even potentially the United States, to reduce sanctions, to reduce the American military presence in the region, potentially to get more concessions out of the international community and out of South Korea. There's concerns about that, and it's an open question. But that's the key deterrence challenge. The other challenge, and it's been mentioned before, in this idea of accepting and figuring out how to deter them, the other concern would be proliferation, which was mentioned before, preventing them from exporting fissile material, exporting weapons, exporting know-how to non-state actors to other rogue regimes. And that is an especially difficult challenge to put forward, as we've learned in the past. So I think it's possible, but it's a very tricky, very difficult set of options with no guarantee of success.
Thank you. We have a couple technical questions from Lauren, and I don't know if anybody has the answers, but Lauren wondered if the miniaturization capability has been confirmed, if the 923 test confirmed thermonuclear capability, but does that imply warhead capability? And she also asked, what can Congress do to engage the international community? Something obviously I would want to know as well, wearing the hat both as a member of Congress, which is only 1 out of 435 and 100, but of course, more importantly, if we have the will as an institution. But does anybody have the answer on the technical question regarding miniaturization? Jenny?
So far, nothing has been officially confirmed in terms of miniaturization capabilities, but experts have believed that North Korea's had miniaturization capability, at least for the medium-ranged missiles, for a very long time. At this time, they still don't have an operational ICBM. It is still in development phase. They certainly have talked about having miniaturization capabilities as of the January nuclear test as well. And so it's one of those things where there's no benefit to underestimating North Korea's technical capabilities. I think we should assume that they have some level of miniaturization capabilities. We don't know how reliable it is. Much like some of their missile systems, we don't necessarily know how reliable, how accurate they are. But certainly we don't necessarily want them to demonstrate that capability either.
Thank you. And Lauren also asked, what can Congress do? Several of my colleagues just went on a CODEL, a congressional delegation visit to the DMZ just last week. I got to chat with some of them about that visit, largely working with our South Korean allies, showing solidarity. You can imagine the consternation and worry in Seoul. What would you suggest a member of Congress can do? And just as importantly, the institution, Lauren further asked, what is the current opinion in Congress right now regarding the issue on the Korean Peninsula? Certainly, I think it's not a partisan issue that I can tell. I think a lot of my friends and colleagues in Congress on both sides of the aisle are also asking, what can we do as individuals in a bipartisan way, as an institution? What are some of your suggestions? We'll go to each of you about what constructive role Congress can play in de-escalation and a diplomatic solution. Let's start with Mike.
Sure. Well, I think that's a great question. As I was talking about before, I think that Congress has a primary role to play right now, especially because we have a president that, unfortunately, I think is in many ways making the situation worse. So I think that first and foremost, it's speaking out. I think that our allies in South Korea and Japan, in particular, know how Washington works. They understand the way that our institutions interact with one another a great deal. And so hearing a repeated, loud message from large numbers of our members of Congress and the institution as a whole about our credibility, our commitment to our allies, and our determination to push for diplomacy is, I think, very important. And I think that continuing a dialogue, frankly, privately with them as well, like the CODEL that went out to the region last week, I think is something that's very important to continually reassure our allies that, again, there are large segments of the U.S. government that do believe in these alliances and that do believe in a responsible and diplomatic path forward. I think they need to hear that.
Jen?
I agree with what Mike said. I would add to that. I think it's important. One of the things that Congress has done very well is rally around sanctions. But I think that there has to be a recognition that sanctions is not the answer. Certainly sanctions are necessary, but there has to be the diplomatic track, and there has to be pressure on the government for diplomacy. And not to get stuck in this over-reliance on sanctions as a policy. But I would also agree that there has to be more outreach to South Korea. And especially there's, sentiment in South Korea these days is very much that their voice is not being heard. So the Trump administration and President Trump has a good relationship, for instance, with Abe, but does not have that same relationship with President Moon. And you can see this when North Korea issues come up, is that his first call is always to Abe. And then later on, eventually he gets to President Moon. And so I think the South Korean people are feeling very unheard and very unsettled about what is the US willing to do unilaterally that will affect their security most prominently. And so I think the more that Congress can be pressuring the administration to really push for dialogue and pursue diplomacy before trying to start a war, as well as really again assuring the allies and talking to the allies and making sure that the U.S. is not doing unilateral actions, I think is very important at this time.
Thank you. And let me go to both Abe and Professor Chan. Abe, what do you think a member of Congress can do? What can I do? What can the institution do to move towards a diplomatic solution?
I think you have a lot of options. I completely agree with Mike and Jenny that Congress, that you, Congressman, have a lot of options, both in terms of holding hearings, asking questions of experts publicly, asking questions of government officials publicly, raising key questions and key challenges to proposals and policies that have been put forward by the administration, not only on questions of diplomacy, pressure, and potentially military action, but also looking at other aspects of our strategy vis-a-vis North Korea, our trade relationships with South Korea and Japan, asking about our broader strategy in Asia. The president is coming to Asia very soon. Asking administration officials about the results of that, about what messages were sent to our allies and to other countries around the region, I think is especially important. Beyond that, you mentioned the CODEL going to Korea, engaging with your counterparts in Korea, also in Japan, I think is important, but you don't have to wait until the next CODEL, because there are also always members of their legislature coming through Washington, looking to talk with their counterparts on the Hill, looking to talk to experts and government officials, and looking to be heard. They don't always agree with their own governments, but there are always important voices. And having those connections between our legislatures, I think, is another important part of ensuring that we have close alliances.
Professor Chan?
Thank you. I agree with all the previous speakers. I think Congress can certainly help to reassure the South Koreans who sometimes feel that they have been sidelined, even chastised. President Trump has not been very kind in terms of trade talks with South Korea, for example, and South Korea's position has moved closer to Chinese position on a number of matters. And I think Congress can also do something privately to reassure that our allies can negotiate seriously with our Secretary of State, whose position I think has been publicly undermined by our own president. The government cannot just speak with multiple voices, and the president has to really back up our own Secretary of State. And this is something, if the Congress of the United States can do to reassure our allies, that would be very, very helpful.
Thank you. And let me just say we have about 10 more minutes. If you have any final questions, you, our viewers, please type them in. We'll try to get to one or two more. The next one is kind of going more to a background type question that I think, Jenny, perhaps you can help us with. We'll see who else can weigh in. But Pedro asked, do any of you believe South Korea is open to unify the peninsula and help develop the former North Korea? But can you sort of address what is the quick 2-minute 101 version of the politics of reunification? And we'll see if anybody else wants to address that.
I think that's more than a 2-minute answer. I think, there is always talk about unification coming from both sides. And I think as time goes on, a lot of that is really political talking points and not necessarily the will of the greater people. Under the Park Geun-hye administration in South Korea, for instance, this last administration, part of the reason why she had emphasized unification policies so strongly was because public polling was showing that the majority of South Koreans were actually not very interested in unification. So I think the politics of unification evolves over time, and it's really not an easy answer. And it's not necessarily that either side is really trying very hard or really willing to risk war in order to get to that endpoint. I think both sides talk a lot about if we can find a way for peaceful unification that we can all agree to the terms of, that would be great. But, you know, again, we're not willing to force it, knowing the enormous cost, knowing the enormous, you know, the suffering that would happen in terms of trying to integrate these two separate political identities now, even if they are national, you know, ethnically the same group of people. So it is sort of a long-term dream, and as generations go by, it becomes more of a political talking point than necessarily an actionable item at any given time.
Anybody else with an insight into reunification?
Yeah, I think if I could chime in, I think that if you ask most South Korean officials, a lot of people in South Korea, if you ask them if they supported unification, they would say yes, absolutely. But if you dig into it, even discounting all of the difficult issues that Jenny mentioned of actually achieving unification, if somehow the North Korean regime just somehow disappeared and unification was achieved without any of those very difficult costs, you're suddenly dealing with a large population of people who are uneducated, unskilled, not engaged with the outside world, poor, xenophobic, raised in a very different, extremely different culture than their counterparts in South Korea. And the project of rebuilding North Korea, of integrating those millions of people into a modern society, would be a multi-generational task. People sometimes point to the unification between East and West Germany, which was a generational program. And it's absolutely nothing even of the same scale that unification of the Korean Peninsula would entail. Just a vastly different set of cultures in which the North Korean people are smaller. The languages have started to diverge a bit. So it's a monumental task, even discounting all of the challenges that Jenny mentioned. So thinking of the costs, the time, the problems, that I think it's an ideal goal, but when you get down to the nitty-gritty of how it would actually work, many people would say maybe we do it at a later time.
If anybody else wants to weigh in on reunification, otherwise I have one other question. I will get to the final question. What, you know, at this point, if we need a roadmap, clearly things are sort of spiraling the wrong way. It seems like we're getting further and further. What would a roadmap to a peaceful diplomatic solution look like in terms of step one, step two? What are the first couple steps we need to take to reverse this momentum the wrong way and start the momentum towards a diplomatic solution? If anybody can suggest what that first step or two should be towards reaching that goal.
Sure. You know, I think that there are a wide variety of different things that could be done to get things started in lowering tensions. And again, I think that's the first priority is here, lowering tensions. Right now, tensions are just so high between the two countries. There's a lot of really intense signaling going back and forth between us and North Korea. Remember, we don't have embassies in each other's countries. The actual dialogue between the two countries is incredibly limited and stilted, frankly, when it happens. And so what you're seeing with the tweets from President Trump, his public comments, you know, military exercises and, you know, flights of B-1 bombers close to the DMZ, these are all messages that are being sent back and forth. This is the form of dialogue we have right now. So the first things that need to happen are, first of all, start to change some of those things. Obviously, the president getting off Twitter would be great, but lowering the rhetoric, one. Start making it clear that you're changing some of the ways in which you're dealing with the military on the peninsula. You can still do exercises and you can still conduct reconnaissance flights and so forth, but maybe pull them back a little bit, maybe scale them down a little bit. While at the same time, what you're trying to do is you are trying to immediately open up dialogue and say, I'm willing to talk here for talking, and you get in the same room with senior officials and senior counterparts. The next step, I think, would be something akin to a scenario where both sides agree to basically halt for some period of time certain things to allow for diplomacy to have a chance. So say 6-month halt on tests for North Korean missiles and nuclear tests, while the United States, say, agrees to stop certain kinds of large-scale military exercises with South Korea, only for a certain period of time, only certain kinds of exercises that would not erode readiness. It's that kind of thing, again, as an example, that can begin to allow a process to play out if, again, the North Koreans are willing. And if they're not willing, then very quickly that gets snapped back and you ramp up the pressure again.
So you're saying, Mike, is like a freeze almost, or a halt might actually be progress in a sense as it trust builds on both sides. I want to go to everybody on the panel on this because I think this is sort of a crux of the matter is what, the end goal is blurry. It's hard to see. What are the short step 1, step 2, just to start moving in the right direction? Let me go to Professor Chan next. Professor Chan?
Thank you. I think I really agree with what Mike has said. One possibility, and I would think the first step, is for the United States to say we are willing to talk without preconditions. That's first step. Second step is to revive the 6-party talk in Beijing, right? Involving the Russians, the Japanese, the Chinese, and both sides of Korea. And the topic would be whether or not it's feasible for our side to stop the military exercises, and in return that they will stop any further nuclear tests or missile tests for a period of 6 months or something like that. And then we can move on to negotiate according to some version of the Iran deal, that they will put a stop to their nuclear program in exchange for some gradual easing of economic sanctions. I don't think we can roll back their nuclear program. The best we can hope for is a freeze, a cease of activities to further develop their weapons program.
Thank you. Jenny, what do you see as the way of starting to move in the right direction, baby steps?
I agree with what's been said in terms of, what you would want ideally is to have unconditional talks to see what's possible. But in order to get there, I think the number one thing has to be that someone has to control President Trump from taunting Kim Jong-un directly, because this is really the most provocative thing that he's doing, beyond the colorful bellicose, language and rhetoric and threats, is that when he's on the world stage calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man and belittling Kim Jong-un, these are things that, are taken as basically the highest attack on the state, the debasing of their leader. And it really forces them to act in a certain way and really prevents the dialogue from being constructive. So, first that has to happen. No more Rocket Man, no more calling Kim Jong-un names, but actually acting with some decorum between world leaders. And then, unconditional talks to see what's possible. And, within the framework of those talks, certainly the first few, early steps would have to be a moratorium on some level on both sides in order to buy time for diplomacy. And from there, it's hard to say what all is possible, but that's really the first step and what really needs to happen in order to try and step back from where we are now.
Thank you. Abe, do you want to give us your thoughts on what those first step or two should be?
Well, I agree with what's been said, that there's a lot of baby steps that can be taken. The first conversation is always talking about the talks and figuring out how you engage with each other. We have a lot of very skilled diplomats. We actually do have ways to talk to North Korea directly, government to government. But as has been said, the president's rhetoric has been cutting out a lot of room for that discussion. If the president were to express enthusiasm or support for diplomacy, to give space to diplomats to do their work and to find ways to move forward, is probably a first step. There's been some talk in this conversation about a freeze. China and Russia have proposed what they call a freeze for freeze, in that North Korea would stop their nuclear missile tests, the United States and Korea would stop their joint exercises. The United States and South Korea rejected that proposal, which I actually agree with. As the Pentagon guy, I don't like giving up exercises. But I do think that it's a mistake to reject that proposal out of hand. I think that the appropriate way forward is to see it as the basis for future negotiation, that it doesn't have to be a freeze for freeze, that it could be a freeze for something. And the key is for our diplomats to have room to have that conversation, to figure out what that something could be, to try to de-escalate that tension. But then there's the final question. I'll stop here. It doesn't seem to me that the president or the administration is interested right now in reducing tension. Their interest seems to be in increasing tension. And they're doing basically everything that they can to make sure that tension stays at a high level. So that to me is the fundamental question.
Thank you. I want to thank our terrific panelists. I really appreciate you in sharing this information with me to help me make informed decisions about security in the Korean Peninsula, and also, of course, with my constituents who helped to provide some excellent questions to increase our understanding. And of course, our viewers, about 10,000 have viewed at least part of this broadcast. So I want to thank everybody for listening. I want to thank Elena and Tom from my staff for staying late and helping to put this together. And thank you all so much for joining us. And for our 4 experts, I hope you'll continue to be in touch with me and my staff to make sure we can make informed decisions. And again, for my constituents, feel free to continue to call my office or visit our website at polis.house.gov. If you're not on our email list, you can sign up there. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.